record to the cloud. There we go. So welcome to the next REFEDS community chat. I'm going to hand this straight over to Albert and Frederik to talk about MFA Profile. Y'all might want to introduce yourselves, and you should have all the sharing privileges that you need.
All right, thank you, Heather. So I guess I will get going then. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Albert Wu. I am the InCommon Federation's Federation Service Manager. InCommon is the United States National Identity Federation. And we're here to talk about the REFEDS MFA profile. Frederik, did you want to introduce yourself?
I could say my name is Frederik Domeij, and I'm from SWAMID Federation in Sweden. And I've been chair for this group that we are about to talk about the result of our work. But I'll handle most of the talk to Albert. I trust in him.
All right, thank you. So I think what we're going to do today is it's going to be fairly informal. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So I will be the slide advancer, I guess, today, and also introduce everybody. Looking at the, the group. Since we have a relatively small group today, I would very much recommend this be as much of a conversation as possible. So at any point, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to interrupt and let us know, and we'll have that discussion. Just to quickly recap, REFEDS MFA profile, as I think everyone here is familiar, is REFEDS multi-factor authentication profile, and it defines a standard way to signal quality of authentication when performing federated single sign-on. And the REFEDS MFA working group subgroup has been tasked to make updates to this profile with, I guess I'll say a set of goals. The first, this is meant to be a clarification of the original profile. And that is because from the lessons we learned deploying MFA profile with NIH in InCommon, we learned there are a number of areas where deployers felt were confused or were unclear about how the profile was to be interpreted. And this update is primarily meant to clarify those ambiguities in order to make the profile clear to understand, easier to understand, and hopefully easier to adopt. It is meant to be backward compatible on the wire original profile. So one of the constraints is that we are not creating a new identifier. We are instead reusing the old one. And we'll get into the backward compatibility challenges throughout this chat in a bit. Finally, time is of the essence. Because the profile is being adopted as we speak, we want to make sure this update is it gets out there as quickly as possible so that it's actually helpful before the adoption gets much further. A lot of folks have helped with this update. Here is an eye chart of the names of folks who have at various points in time attended the working group meetings and helped with editing. And there are more folks who didn't make it to the calls, but nonetheless provided valuable feedback. So I won't go through all the names for time's reason. But many of the folks here are actually on this call. So if you have questions for specific persons, we're probably here to answer your questions. And this is a sort of a brief time map of how we came to this point. As I mentioned, it began sometime in early 2021 when NIH came forward and called for support for REFEDS MFA profile in its new federated single sign-on gateway. It basically said if you want to access NIH resources using your IDP, you will support REFEDS MFA profile along with a couple of other elements like RNS. That triggered a wave of adoptions among InCommon identity providers, and hence raised a number of questions. That led to this group forming, creating an FAQ. I should say reforming, creating an FAQ to clarify some of the questions, and that eventually led to REFEDS Assurance Group's request for this group to have taken the further step to make recommendations and eventually update this profile. And that's where we are today. This is just for clarification. If you're familiar with the REFEDS specifications consultation process, we are not there yet. Just want to be clear. This profile isn't done. Instead, we've reached a point where we felt there are just too many questions we couldn't answer by ourselves. We really needed the broader community's input, feedback, to help us to essentially do a sanity check to make sure we are still going in the right direction and we're hitting the mark. So today is that, and along with the offline processes, is to really gather feedback from you all to help us understand if we are going in the right directions, if this profile is proceeding as you would expect. And we are looking for help. We are hitting some details, as Scott will talk about in a bit, where we might be exhausting our expertise, for example, in areas OIDC, as well as challenges in implementation in your local regions. Right? We want this profile to be actually practically deployable. So how this matches up with your local requirements and how to reconcile any conflicts and ambiguities is what we wanted to know. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Scott Cantor, who will take us through the details, a bit more details today. Scott?
Let me get off mute here. Hello. Yeah, so I'll go through this slide, I guess, fairly quickly, but this is just a motivational slide for, what the original purpose of the profile was. We'll get back into the strong authentication issue, I think, in a little bit. But obviously, the whole point of this is to establish some kind of a common signaling standard to prevent people from having to negotiate all this stuff individually between parties. And MFA was the focus at the time that this work began and at the time that we picked the work back up, because it was viewed as the most widely adopted means of achieving this. I think we're all aware that things are changing and that MFA may not in the future be the most obvious way to achieve stronger authentication. So we'll come back to that as we talk about sort of where this might need to go in the future. But I'll move on to the next slide. I think we can skip this one. This is really just talking about what Albert just mentioned. So we'll get to the highlights here. So I'm going to run through really briefly what we did to the profile, and hopefully you've had a chance to read through it. And so this isn't just coming as some sort of a big shock to people. What we've really tried to do is clarify and tighten up. That's really what we were trying to achieve, and just sort of adjust the presentation to keep it short, but be as complete as we can to avoid having to have people refer off to additional documents and do other things, with the exception of not trying to repeat a lot of the material from the SAML or OIDC standard documents. So where the sort of front matter of the original document was really short, and actually was somewhat SAML specific, we've created a longer introduction that tries to clarify what the profile is about, its limitations, talk about sort of the structure of the rest of the document. We have a terms and definitions section, and we also have some material up front that makes it really clear that this is not intended as an institutional signaling mechanism. And there are some really, really important reasons why it's a bad idea to use this as an institutional signaling mechanism. And they have to do with the tightness of the language and the need to avoid exceptions. So we wanted to get that material in there as early as possible into the document. Then we introduced the profile identifier as we did before. We're using that identifier for both SAML and OIDC. And we talk about very explicit requirements for using that identifier and signaling the profile. And there's a little bit about the potential implications of versioning on the use of the identifier. So it's a bit more detail in the introduction. Next slide, please. So the actual meat of the authentication requirements have been fleshed out quite a bit. There's no longer a reference to an ITU document that lots of us probably haven't read. There is a focus on factor independence and a bit more in the way of examples of sort of how this is intended to work. The factor independence point is emphasized as referring not just to actual authentication, but also to recovery, which is a very significant gap that most of our institutions have, where realistically we can authenticate with MFA, but we have very serious compromises in a lot of cases around our account recovery processes. And we don't exactly know what to say about that beyond that it's an issue, and you have to deal with it. But I think this is likely to be an area of subsequent discussion, just in the area of best practice and campuses sharing ideas and sharing practice and so forth. So this is an area of probably future emphasis for the document, we think. Another section is going to be a pretty big one that is likely to trigger some controversy, and that's around the validity lifetime question. And what we've tried to do is to marry the issues around single sign-on with things like Duo's Remember Me feature, and other MFA solutions probably have similar kinds of cookie-based solutions, because ultimately they amount to the same thing. It's how often do you actually need to challenge the user with specific factors in order to comply with the profile. We are not necessarily saying that 12 hours is the answer, but we felt the need to put a stake in the ground to provoke comment and to get people to weigh in, and so that we can collectively decide what the consensus view is. What we do believe is that we need to say something. We intend this document to be prescriptive about that. The actual value may be infinite or it may be an hour, but we have to make that decision, and we need to say what it is, because right now it's infinite, because the document doesn't say anything. So we need to make a decision about what we want to say. We also have material about failure modes. We feel strongly that we did have consensus among the group that fail open was not appropriate for this profile. In all the different cases that may entail, it may be a question of technical failure, it may be a question of creating exemptions for people, policy exemptions, things like that. What we're saying is that's not appropriate for REFEDS. If you want to do that, then you need your own local signaling mechanism to handle that, and that's exactly why you shouldn't use REFEDS for your institutional signaling, because almost all of us have policy exceptions and various kinds of things that we deal with on our campus, because we internalize that business risk. But when you're dealing with REFEDS, you're externalizing that business risk. And so we don't feel that that's appropriate to do. So we're much more prescriptive, and feel the document needs to be much more prescriptive about what people need to do. It doesn't necessarily need to be strict, but it needs to be specific. It needs to tell people exactly what they can expect on both sides. Next slide, please. The SAML stuff is not really at all a change, but is fleshed out to a significant degree by focusing on what not to do, because these are things that have caused deployer problems. And so in addition to moving the SAML part into its own section, which is, we think, more appropriate, there's also a focus on various kinds of practices that are really aren't going to work well with the use of the authentication context mechanism in SAML, which includes things like signaling multiple contexts at the same time, using the very, very rarely used inexact comparison options that SAML has that tend not to be implemented by very many deployers. I don't know to what extent we actually discourage the use of forced authentication, but it's more that we are not addressing the use of forced authentication in the context of the profile. And that isn't really relevant to signaling MFA. And that has to do with the fact that you cannot obtain predictable behavior from IDPs around exactly how they interpret force FN when it comes to the different factors involved. So the way people mostly tend to use it tends to be in order to achieve goals that are not actually achievable with that feature. And so that is likely to be something that the additional guidance that the profile will probably need in the area of deployment help, FAQs and so forth will probably need to cover more. We have error handling recommendations in the document that just sort of focus on what you can expect and what you need to do as a deployer. There's very little that you can prescribe in that area, but just telling people what they can and can't expect is kind of the focus. And then there are some explicit examples of what the messages look like when the profile is used. Next slide, please. And in the case of OIDC, we basically did all of the same things. The original document, of course, was SAML specific. This document is not. We've introduced essentially a draft binding for OIDC, which is a fairly natural copy of the one for SAML. We have, again, signaling and syntax and examples, in this case in JSON. It discourages essentially some of the same kinds of things that we discourage in SAML, because OpenID basically works the same way and will have the same difficulties. One area that we did not go into was covering the so-called AMR claim in OIDC. OIDC actually splits the notion of the sort of class of authentication from what they call the method. And they have a way to sort of say, well, I'm doing this generic thing called MFA, but I actually did, duo plus a password plus, whatever. We don't know if people are ever going to want to go into that sort of territory. We're not covering it in this document. That's being left out of scope. So that's, an issue that people might have feedback about. And again, error handling discussion, again, all that stuff's really the same as it is in SAML. So it's not really much different. So naturally, the sections pretty well mirror each other in a lot of ways, for the most part. So let me pause there before I go on and see if there are any questions that we want to cover. We're intentionally trying to go this material pretty quickly so that people have time to just interact and have dialogue. So before I go through the last couple slides, I'll just pause. Nobody? Okay. Go ahead and advance the slide, and we'll talk about sort of the operational implications. I kind of covered these. I'll hammer at them again. We are not constraining the way that people handle account reset in this document. There's nothing in the document that says this is how you need to do account reset, but we are calling out that it is an implication that people need to address to make sure that use of a single factor does not allow you to reset another factor, because if you do that, then the profile's non-phishiness essentially goes away. Its phishing resistantness goes away. So, and a lot of us have seen phishing attacks and exposures based on exactly this issue. So that's why we felt the need to make a point of it. So this is really a call out to tell people, hey, this is probably something that you need to review your processes around. And if if we come up with good answers, then that's probably an area we should start to share practice. It's really important to understand that in our world, identity assurance and MFA are orthogonal. And the problem is that in the rest of the world, there's often a lot of use of identity assurance as a means of achieving better account reset practices. And that may be what we find we need, but it's going to be very important to keep those, somewhat separate in our worldview, because they are orthogonal in terms of the way our specs are being constructed. And then the second bullet, again, I've hammered at this. I will keep hammering at it. You do not want to use the REFEDS profile internally. Do not do that. The document doesn't say it as strongly as I'm saying it, because I'm the one that has to live with all the questions and problems that come up when people try to use our software and do that. You will not want to do that. Your local policies are your local policies, and the REFEDS document is the REFEDS document, and they will diverge over time. There is absolutely no question of that in most cases. So it is very, very easy to simply If they're the same for you, then you can treat them the same and you can use them equivalently. And when they diverge, you can treat them non-equivalently, and then you are able to do what you need to do. So this is a very, very important thing that I think we're going to need to get across, and we'll probably cover that more in the companion documents down the road. Next document or next slide. So when we look forward, some of the things that we're thinking about as a working group that are not in the document per se, but things that we think we probably are going to need to deal with as a community are, really it's the ongoing story here. What are we going to do for governance of this to keep the profile current? This has kind of been a one-off exercise that took place, and we don't really have a plan exactly for, what the next steps will be in the future. And if we do have new versions, what does that mean for existing usage? We're kind of taking a single bite at the apple here, taking the current version and just saying, let's clean it up. Even if we make some tweaks to it, we're not so widely adopted that we don't think we can get away with that. But down the road, if we can do that again, then we've clearly been unsuccessful, because that means nobody's using it and nobody cares if we change it. So we're going to have to think about how new versions impact that usage. Which likely may mean introducing new identifiers that have different semantics. So we need to think about that. And then related to that, what about new technology? As existing technology diminishes in its perceived quality or its actual quality, what do we do about that? What do we do about, fundamentally, what do we do about WebAuthn? Single factor WebAuthn is not multi-factor. That doesn't necessarily mean it isn't strong authentication. Right now, this document is a multi-factor profile because that's where it began, and that was the mandate that we had in revising it. I think we all collectively as a group feel it likely that it may be plausible that the future we want is really a strong authentication profile, not a multi-factor authentication profile. So that's something that, again, ties into the first issue. How do we, what does that mean? How do we introduce it? How do we deal with that? And that's not going to be the last word on the subject. So, how do we deal with the future in its infinite possibility? So that's it for that slide. And I think the last one is just us saying thanks. We appreciate everybody showing up and hearing us out for a half hour. What we'd like to get is review and comment on the current state of the document so that we can make the consultation a bit easier for everybody later. So if there's controversial things that people think need to change, we'd like to get them changed now. So this is an opportunity to weigh in informally before people need to weigh in formally. And then obviously we need federations, we need IDPs and SPs to support and promote the use of this profile. We don't think that needs to wait for this document to come out. I think we've kind of missed the mark if there's some sort of big holding pattern that people need to be in terms of waiting for the new version to be published. And I'll leave it at that.
And I already see a hand raised. Look at that. Andrew, what questions do you have today?
I have two, but I'll just start with one at a time here. I guess I feel super fortunate. Our IDP, our settings are essentially 12-hour remember me. So that seems very nice of you guys to use my setting. But I actually wonder about the basis of specifying anything there at all as a requirement for the profile. I'm curious what are the risks or attacks, or is there like a NIST justification that says do this for this long for the cookies or tokens or whatever, and that's not really pushback on your choice there at all. Actually, I'm actually just very curious about collectively why we would specify it at all.
Well, I think, as I said, for me, the priority is that we say something. I don't personally care all that strongly what we say. What we are currently doing is not saying anything, which means we're implying that it can be infinite, but we're not saying it. So if what we want is infinite, then we need to say that. To answer the question, I think the answer is that the perception is that after some length of time, you've turned it into single factor authentication because it's a what you have factor. It's a cookie. So at some point, the multi-factor approach, action that led to the cookie becomes a single factor, but whether we can agree on when that point is crossed is not clear to me. The 12-hour amount, as you know, of course, was chosen primarily because it roughly matches a lot of people's single sign-on durations. And so that session duration is essentially the equivalent of Remember Me cookie for all intents and purposes. They are functionally the same. And so we were trying to marry the two concepts to make sure that it's consistent, and then just pick a time that seemed plausible so that we can provoke the necessary discussion and reach consensus on what we want the document to say.
And relative to NIST, this wasn't, I think, the group's primary intention, but obviously to the degree we can make this profile easily mappable to a national or regional requirements, that helps. It just so happens NIST 863 does mention 12 hours in AAL2 as is the time period. I don't know if that was the reason why we chose 12 hours. I think what Scott said is much more, so it's sort of a common sense number.
Yeah,
I think it was more the full work day.
Yeah, it's the full workday idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we picked that NIST as well.
Yeah, I guess you make a good point, Scott, that the SSO session itself is probably similarly based in a little token of something you have, and I suppose I could argue that usually you're talking about compromising someone's computer in order to access that token, and that could happen in almost any time frame possible or whatever. But it's nice to see that. I mean, I understand the justification there, and I don't know. I suppose so far, have you guys had anybody come at you with pitchforks yet about it, or?
I don't think enough people have seen it yet.
No, we're trying to instigate the pitchforks.
Yeah, we're prompting the pitchforks, or we're asking for pitchforks.
It's definitely one of the reasons for this open review before we hit consultation.
Yeah. I mean, any long-lived token is riskier the longer it lives. So the chance of compromise increases as time increases. And the reason why you don't change things is effort, right? I mean, in a perfect world, we would change our passwords every 30 seconds, but obviously that's not realistic. But when it comes to this, the cost is you re-authenticate. Well, if authentication is that painful, you probably have bigger problems than this issue. So the presumption is at some point, it's justifiable to say, you know what, you really ought to log in again. That isn't so expensive for you or us that we shouldn't make you do it. A SAML key, for example, also is more vulnerable the longer it lives. The problem is it's unbelievably painful to change it. And that's why you don't change it. It's not because you shouldn't or don't want to, or, so it's a balancing of security practice with, risk.
So let's hop over to Thomas.
Yes, we have a deployment with Switch Edu ID of about 55,000 MFA enabled accounts. And I think we started off with a Remember Me time of 24 hours or something like that. But afterwards, on the request of universities, we extended that to 1 week. And we are using the REFEDS profile as a basis. So we don't really like to have the version numbering keeping the same and reducing it to 12 hours because it will be pretty difficult to deploy that with existing services without interruption. However, with changing the version number, I think we could easily make a change to a shorter period, and the service is asking for a shorter period, would then enforce it, and the users would have the option to pick the one or the other or something like that. So
I think
that's the situation we have.
I think we have to balance the question of, do we want to change the identifier on people now, or would we rather just say, what's the number we can all live with for remember me for now, and, decide to make that change later? I mean, that's the point. Either of those is plausible, and it's a difficult question to, in a small working group, it's a difficult question to answer that in isolation and say, this is the right move to make. Strictly speaking, introducing a new identifier would have been an obvious thing to do, and that was sort of ruled out of scope of what we were what we were engaged in doing. But that's the future question. I can say as a deployer personally that while I certainly know how to make my software juggle multiple policies and do the right thing, a lot of people don't. And so we perceive that there is a significant deployment cost and a particular, a significant barrier to adoption to go down the road of introducing a new identifier at this point in time. And I would probably argue on the side of let's put a stake in the ground and pick a time we can live with. And, if that's a week, then it's a week. If it's, a month, it's a month. But again, that's just my personal opinion. But that's the kind of that's really what we need to hear. That's what we need to know.
And we actually had lengthy discussions, especially early on in the profile editing, about this point. And it's like, as I said, this is one of the reasons why we're holding open reviews as early as we could, because one of the things I personally would really want to understand better is just how widespread the profile support adoption is today, because that very much impacts what we can realistically do with the new updates, right? Whether we have to change the identifier version in order to keep the existing implementations working, or can we absorb as a community a breaking change in the current identifier behavior. As Scott said, it's a tough call, right? So
I also want to clarify real quick. When I said it's a single factor, right? It's not a single factor if you're also requiring the user to log in with the password too. Now, the problem is that of all the factors, the password is the one that is viewed as the most worthless. And so, and we know from personal experience that, what we've seen is people will phish the password. And once they've, if you have a long remember me policy, then that attacker ends up with a strong foothold, or a stronger foothold than they would otherwise have. But yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think you can make a case for a longer remember me period. But if we need to separate the discussion of single sign-on from remember me, then we're going to have to be careful about how we do that, because I don't think we want a 1 week SSO period, or that really is a single factor. And so that's what we'll have to sort of figure out how we want to tackle, and be a little careful about how we deal with that. So that was one of the challenges with making it longer, was how do we separate the idea of, remembering a single factor from remembering all the factors.
Right, and something else to consider as well. I mean, I'm very NIST focused. I don't read a lot of necessarily the international equivalents, but that 12 hours is, if you go beyond the 12 hours, technically AAL1 in NIST speak, right? You're at the lowest level of securing. So if the purpose of this is to allow for meeting some of those higher levels, and I know it was Kyle that did a big presentation on how well these things, what we're doing, matches up with the actual national requirements that people are trying to deal with. That's something else to consider, that honestly, I mean, I think just reiterating what Scott said a couple of times, it's like, we're aware that that's an issue, but we could meet for the next 2 years. We wouldn't come up with the right answer. We would just, maybe we'd convince ourselves of a different answer, but we don't know what the right answer is. And that's That's one of the things we really want to hear.
Yeah, I just noticed that I wasn't accurate enough beforehand, because I mentioned remember me 1 week, but it's the second factor only for 1 week.
Yeah.
The session is shorter.
Yeah, that's why. I presume that was the case. That's why I realized
Yeah,
I kind of I exaggerated earlier when I said what I said, so I felt like I should correct them.
Yeah, but that as you were saying that, I was thinking about your point that, well, I guess, yeah, I still have to have that second factor cookie somehow along with the user's password, right? So either I have to do some auth on the, or trick the user into doing an auth for me or something.
The other thing is we don't want to get too hung up, I think, on Duo's feature, right? Because there are other technologies, and I think Microsoft, I think, is a bit more laissez-faire when it comes to the way they implement this stuff. I think their view is you issue an OAuth token that lasts for a really long time. And, you know, they do that with services, you know, pretty frequently, for example. So we want to be a little careful and not make assumptions about exactly how everything works, because we know, you know, the way Duo works, or we know the way this or that works. So we're going to need to be careful about how that's why the language is so hard. It was really easy to marry the two, treat them the same, and just say, let's just do 12 hours and move on, again, because that's also what NIST says. You know, that's a reasonable motivation for making that case. You know, again, this is exactly why you don't want to use this internally, but obviously, you know, what Switch is doing is not internal. I mean, they're doing something external. So they literally adopted this profile, and now we're coming along and saying, well, we're going to change this, you know, rule. So that's why we have to be cognizant of that. And, you know, we may end up deciding that we just have to allow for it.
I'll just make a quick observation about this particular point. I'm not sure, Albert, I think it's around 200 or so US universities have tested using the NIH security check tool to validate, in particular, their MFA implementation. And NIH has accepted REFEDS MFA in its current version as good enough to meet their AL2 requirement for their FISMA moderate services. Many of their services are classified at that level. And so just to say, and so even though it's effectively infinite by not being addressed, it still has been accepted by at least that one agency. And NSF is going down the same path right now.
We tried to get them to come to the calls and tell us that, and we couldn't get them to tell us that.
I know. Well, so I'm just letting you know for what it's worth. So things, especially in the federal agencies, I have to say, given my limited experience with them, they do not necessarily follow the NIST standards very strictly. They also have huge problems of migrating legacy systems over many years and all that kind of stuff, the same kind of things that we're talking about. Their change management is pretty steep. So that's something that happens over a long period of time, if at all. Also, I might just wonder, for a point of comparison, not quite the same, but instructive, how long does it take for all the federations to change their key lengths? We were doing that for a year. Are we done?
I had no idea. I don't think it's comparable in terms of risk personally, but I don't know.
Yeah, and that applies to everybody, and the FAA doesn't apply to everybody, but it still applies to a large set.
So Andy, I think you actually had a second question you were going to ask.
I
Do you remember
do.
what it was?
Yeah, no, I wrote it down because I wasn't.
Good job.
Scott, you made a comment about the relationship between identity assurance and password recovery. Somewhere in the midst of what you're saying, and hopefully that's going to jog your memory there. But I was wondering if you could explain that. I wasn't sure what you were saying actually.
I was referring to the fact that to my general, that there are a lot of cases in which avoiding use of a single factor to recover the other factor tends to involve using out-of-band information about a person. And a lot of times the out-of-band information is either established or in some cases presumed based on some idea of knowing who the person is. And so assuming that they're the only likely person, and again, I don't necessarily buy this because birthdays are not secret information. So using people's birth dates the way people do for account recovery, I think is a horrible practice, but that's the kind of thrust of it. And when we looked at the NIST documents on the last call, we were curious what they had to say about account recovery. And as best we could tell, they're kind of weird about it at AAL2, but at AAL3, they definitely were essentially as much as saying you need to rely on, reproofing the person in order to do the account recovery, which effectively, relies on having identity assurance as a precondition for doing MFA, because obviously you can't deploy MFA if you don't have a recovery mechanism. So they seem to marry the two concepts. They're a little weird about it, the way they phrase it at the lower AL levels. So, and of course, so in their mind, I'm not sure what they would say about, AL1 in particular. But anyway, the point was just that even though they may be separate in our conception of how to do things, they may not ultimately be separate as a deployment matter if you're attempting to create a reasonably strong account recovery process.
Yeah, it's interesting to compare MFA to strong authentication, just to think about it that way. Like, well, okay, right, to your point, here at OSU, we do use we ask the person to identify themselves with their university ID and a birth date for account recovery, and then we send a PIN to a pre-registered alternate email or phone number. But so those are like technically be sort of like different factors and maybe multiple factors, but are they actually strong? That's a good question. Yeah,
but it gets at the issue. I mean, it's at least means you've thought about the problem or considered that, you shouldn't just let the person fish a password and then call up the help desk and say, hey, I know the password, so reset my phone. That's what we're trying to say, obviously. And, we think it's just something that we need to be clear on. Or we need to be clear that it's a problem, even if we can't be as clear on what the answer to the problem is.
Yeah, and the other way around as well.
Yeah.
Steal a phone and use the phone to create a new password.
This seems like a good moment to do a quick plug for the next IAM online webinar, where UNC is going to talk about going passwordless and using WebAuthn and the strong authentication efforts over there. That's on the 19th.
I mean, it seems pretty obvious with passkeys about to drop widely that having a spec go out that says, sorry, but that's not good enough. That I would expect and hope that would generate some conversation and some pushback and some questions. And I think that speaks to how rapidly we decide what the next phase of this really should be.
So I've looked at the passkey stuff, and there is a way for that to be MFA.
Yeah, there is
as well. And so is this profile version 1.1, is it compatible with that, with at least an MFA implementation of passkey?
I would think so. I'm really referring to the pinless variant that is pretty common today. Because WebAuthn is still a thing, and I'm including WebAuthn in with passkeys. I mean, I know they're theoretically sort of not the same, but really they kind of are. It's I don't think anybody would have a question, or I can't imagine someone disputing that WebAuthn itself is not a reasonable factor, but it just definitionally is only one. So
does it have
remember me concepts? Sorry, what was that? No, go ahead.
I was thinking about the remember me, the 12-hour lifetime thing, and I actually don't know enough about passkey to know if your browser ever reprompts you once you've been to a website or not.
It does. I don't think that they really include a notion of caching the PIN or caching. They definitely don't cache the WebAuthn conversation in any way. That's not a thing.
It'd be more like when the application session ends and it asks for and it needs to reauth, and your browser might prompt you again. And
Right. But there could be pin caching. Sure. I wouldn't, that would be a client side issue, you know, to cache the pin, just like with a smart card, you know, there's options to cache pins and things like that. So those are all, but again, you know, it comes down to, well, you really want to cache a pin for a week? Probably not. I mean, that seems like a pretty unreasonable thing to do. It doesn't really seem justifiable.
And I think, and the other, I mean, this is probably obvious. The other point is that we didn't see a way to say, oh, and by the way, passkey or WebAuthn is acceptable, even though it's only one factor, to meet all of this without just completely rewriting and re-envisioning the whole thing. Because then you're like, okay, well, now we're not talking about MFA, we're talking about comparing a whole bunch of specific technologies, and we'd have to get into a, you know, where is passkey on the spectrum versus, you know, Duo RSA token plus password, and it was just like, yeah, that's a different profile that maybe is more important than this one, but is not going to come out of a refinement of this profile.
So one of the things that we talked about throughout this edit is the MFA profile, at least as I understand it, really was developed to convey a quality of authentication. Right? It is not meant to convey specific methods of authentication. It just so happens at the time of its original development, MFA were synonymous and one-to-one associated with strong authentication, right? And that's starting to change, and hence our conversation today. So one of my questions for everybody going forward would be, going forward in the future of this profile, right? Is it more important to continue to convey quality of authentication? If so, how do we measure quality? Right, that I think the answer to that directly relates to how do we evolve this, right?
Yeah. Yep. No, I think, you know, Eric hit the nail on the head. I mean, the problem is we intuitively know WebAuthn is probably good enough, but who are we to say, and what criteria are we using to judge that, and what about everything else? And that's the governance problem. So conceptually, it seems easy to do a strong authentication profile, but the details are seemingly a bit unclear for how we would do that. So for what we were doing, it was clear that that was just out of scope, and we just have to live with the fact that if you want to use WebAuthn, you need to put a pin on it.
This reminds me of, or makes me wish for the, gosh, I wish I remembered who did it. But for the identity assurance stuff, there was this fantastic little graphic or chart of where each, like, the different standards sort of related to each other, and, you know, high and low and medium, and
I think that's
something like that for authentication. Yeah, something like that for auth would be fun to say, like, well, you know, WebAuth without a pin falls here, and password falls off the end, and whatever.
Yeah. And then there's the whole school of thought that, well, you're supposed to just tell the SP all that, and they're supposed to figure it out and decide for themselves. And of course, if we believed that that was viable, we wouldn't be here. So,
and by the way, that's the exact kind of help we're looking for.
Yeah.
So is not the subgroup here, but I guess the REFEDS assurance group, committee, whatever they are they intending to look soon at, like, WebAuthn in some fashion, or like, what's the next move for that group to get, you know, to try and stay current or ahead of the new tech that's coming out?
The REFEDS assurance working group is focused exclusively now on revving the REFEDS assurance framework to V2. There's nothing else on the current work plan, basically, once that's done. And of course, the revving of the MFA profile to address some of the implementation questions that arose in response to NIH's telling everyone, okay, go do it. So you've sounds like the subgroup has done that, which is kind of what its charge was. And
I would go ahead. One thing I
that.
want to add real quick is we are, you know, every year we develop the whole REFEDS work plan. So if there's a lot of interest in this, then by all means, this is something that the community can pursue. So when the call goes out saying we're looking for what the community wants REFEDS to work on in 2023, we'd love to hear that. Okay, Tom, I interrupted you. Sorry.
Not at all. I just wanted to kind of stepping back a couple of paces, that the REFEDS MFA profile, even the current version, has been quite successful. It's been solving the problems it was meant to address, and growingly so. So I think that's, so it was not that we needed to, had a big defect. There were lots of questions about implementation. Once we kind of stirred things up and got everyone looking at it again. So that's good. I don't know that it's another step to talk about moving to strong authentication and changing the nature of what we're talking about. And there's a lot of things antecedent to this profile that probably need to change before we'd be in a position to really know how to have a replacement or an upgrade or a successor to this that's not just in the MFA terms. All the federal security standards still talk about MFA. They don't have any stronger notion of stronger authentication. They will probably have to change too, but it might be premature for us to kind of be way out in front on that. In terms of needing to solve problems that our members actually have.
Then just let's just make the key the WebAuthn and stuff fulfill MFA.
I recall when Duke did an IAM online a while back about their WebAuthn implementation, and they were very aware, obviously, about the difference between that or trying to make it meet MFA requirements. And so they indeed, their implementation was sensitive to it, and they've done a good job. It's you're going to do WebAuthn, that's not going to be the big problem for you to make a multi-factor version of it.
I'm thinking the certification stuff in WebAuthn solves part of that problem and make it compatible with the MFA profile.
Mm-hmm.
And possible passcodes as well.
I guess it's an interesting aspect on the governance side, right? So if someone, if someone said, hey, WebAuthn, it satisfies REFEDS MFA, and they say it themselves, is that a bona fide statement? How would you feel about that when someone said new technology X came around and said, oh yeah, I fulfill REFEDS MFA, trust me. So that governance and oversight, that's an interesting question. I don't know where that sits on a REFEDS working plan, or are there other standards bodies trying to make a thing in there? Kantara, IETF, others? Interesting question.
NIST, I think, is incubating some effort right now around strength of different authentication technology. So it could be in a while they'll come forth with something. We'll see. Maybe not. I'm not aware of any other effort bill like that, Chris.
What's happening in the OIDC, I guess, more commercial space? What do they do? Is there any lowercase standard? Is there any standardized behavior for either MFA or WebAuthn or whatever there, or just nobody really care?
So I would, is there any standardized behavior outside of, no.
Right.
That's easy, no. But that said, I mean, so much more attention right now, the buzz is going towards passkey, WebAuthn, FIDO. The FIDO conference is in less than 2 weeks at this point, and it's gotten a lot of buzz of different types of groups that are attending.
I think you can say at the this is an inference, not anything concrete that anyone has said, but if you look at how the larger identity ecosystem, and I'm talking Facebook, Google, Microsoft, right? If you look at what they do, they divorce session length from specifically challenges to MFA. They do track it frequently, like in Microsoft, in Azure, you can create a requirement about when when how long a given challenge can be, but if you look at what their products do out the door, it seems to be create the session using MFA, with an external challenge, and then keep that session as long as you want until you have a reason to kill it. And I know yes, technically the session token is refreshed as you go, but in terms of challenges to the users, they seem to natively care about doing it on that once a month or once a lifetime or once a browser login.
I think it really depends on what sector you're looking at too, right? The commercial web is going to have one perspective on that, where they, just the simple fact that there's an MFA hoop, that's enough. That's all they need to worry about. But I know a lot of the recent publicized security breaches that involved phishable MFA have received a lot of attention. So the quality of MFA is definitely being talked about. Looking at the time, this was fantastic. This was a great conversation. I encourage you all to keep chatting. There is an active Slack channel. If you've got more questions, you can go there. If you don't know where that is, drop me a note and I'll get you a link. Albert, do you want to do any quick wrap up?
Yeah, it's just a quick mention from a timing perspective. I had mentioned timing is of the essence for this, and I think ideally we would like to bring this profile into consultation by the REFEDS meeting time this winter in December, preferably earlier. So I very much encourage everybody to send in comments and feedback and solutions as quickly as possible. In addition to what we've talked about today, I know we have comments already from Switch, from Lucas, regarding similar points Thomas made earlier. I know we reached out to Roland regarding OIDC behavior, and he's provided really valuable feedback. And I'll post those with their permissions on the wiki. But in the meantime, please add yours so we can start curating and making changes. Most importantly, at this point, we spent a lot of time talking about the 12-hour period. Is I guess a thumbs up, down kind of situation. Is that something we want to correct? Is that something we can leave in? I didn't hear clear preference one way or the other on this call, so keep going.
Yeah, definitely something to get solid feedback on. I think today it was getting the question into their head so they can think about it. Great. All right. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. Have a great rest of your day, and we will have another one of these soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.